So moving from the ideas of nationalism and patriotism, we can discuss the evolution of ethnicity in politics. The state has played a large role in the creation of ethnicities, which are a relatively new phenomenon. Before, and in many traditional societies, the relationship has been on kinship, based on kinship networks. We could talk about tribes, where the core form of social interaction is based on this extended family. But again, evolutionarily speaking, an increase in trade led to more people coming together daily. They were based in cities, right? So they saw each other constantly. And naturally, they looked for common forms of communication, common forms of order. And these are things based on language, of course, norms, customs. The state began to help enshrine or otherwise encourage these things by creating laws and edicts published in particular languages, for example. Eventually, political elites saw that they could benefit from this idea of ethnicity, and the state became the embodiment of the people. In the 18th century, European national identity began to evolve. The state began to be the defender of the national values and national independence. This changes the nature of authority. It's now about, at this point, defending the national interest versus traditional authority. It's a new approach to the stationary bandit. It's no longer just that you will listen to me, you'll be loyal to me because I am in charge. Instead, it's I represent the nation. Okay? And states found that they could mobilize around nationalism to fight off potential enemies, but also to expand for abstract political concepts or for material gains. A great case of this is Napoleon. Okay? And Napoleon did this in France in the 19th century. He expanded this French-led revolution to other states. And so here you can see a picture of Napoleon's empire as he moves across Europe. Other states reacted to this threat by, and again, think of this virus notion that we talked about the other day, eat or be eaten, adapt or die. So what did the other states do? They adapted their own national identities in reaction to Napoleon. So this whole idea of nationalism is very much a 19th century phenomenon. Very important. A 19th century phenomenon. It didn't really exist before then. Okay. Now, as these other states tried to adopt their own national identities, think about the problems that they encountered. Okay? Think about multinational, multi-ethnic empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire pictured here. You've got Poles, Czechs, Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, Austrians, Slovenes, Germans, Ukrainians. And what happens? Well, you've got a wave of ethnic-based revolutions in 1848. Multi-ethnic empires were on the out in Europe by the 19th century. Nation states with one dominant nation in charge of the state became the rising force. This also leads to new expectations from the state. Obligation runs two ways. The state claims to defend national interests. So what are you going to do for me and my nation? So we move from a primordial to an instrumental understanding of ethnicity and more directly nation. Now we're concerned with process here. How does it happen? And there's a great archaeological metaphor that we can use. Elites are tasked with digging through layers of time to pull out relevant histories, symbols, common roots, mythical or real, in order to mobilize around nationalism. So the goals here are threefold. One, rediscovery of significant historical events. Two, the reinterpretation of those events in politically advantageous ways. And then three, the mobilization of the masses around these newly defined events. History here becomes a tool to inspire and rally publics. Not just history, but these other aspects of ethnicity that we talked about. Language, right? Fight to keep your national language. So, for example, historical clarifications are used to create new and ostensibly more sympathetic political identities. Elites with the power to recreate history have the ability to mold identity, and the question of who owns the past becomes one of who is able to identify him or herself and the other at any given time and place. So here's a little picture to get you thinking about the archaeological metaphor. So you dig down. you as a political elite, as a political entrepreneur, and you find an old sword, okay, way down through the layers. This sword was thrown into the dirt as some sad and scared knight ran away from a losing battle. But you reinterpret this now. This was the time enormous forces were against us, but we survived. This sword becomes not a representative, not a symbol of failure, but a symbol of survival. Okay? Keep digging. Right? You find a document of laws. They might never have been executed because it was impossible, because there was a weak state. But you can use this to show that the state has a long history. Okay? Even if the state had very little control over the territory, even if the state was really a city-state, it couldn't expand beyond the town borders, you can point to this document of laws and say, yes, we've been around for 1,200 years. Okay? You find a coin somewhere in this mess of dirt. It may have been worthless because of hyperinflation, but it's got a picture of an old king on it. So you trumpet that king, who no one's even heard of at this point, as a hero. This was a great king. And you create this national myth. Okay? In all these cases, what you're doing is you're reinforcing common bonds. You're using charged events from the past to manipulate identities. Or you're taking events with very little significance and you're adding significance to rally people around it. You're putting a spin on history. Frequently, this involves status reversal through the creation of myths of heroic sacrifice. So again, as I mentioned with that knight, sad, pitiful, desperate, turn that around. Honorable, the last fighter around, fighting for our survival. Okay. So this is how political elites can help manipulate nations. Now, often nationalism is more about the other than the national group in question. It's about separating us from them. And so here we can talk about ethnic conflict. Ethnic conflict is the process of two or more ethnic groups fighting for advantage. Okay? It's a zero-sum game. Advantage for one implies disadvantage for another. Now, this isn't necessarily about sovereignty. As I mentioned before, perhaps the one ethnic group wants more say in the state, more rights to tax their own citizens, a greater share of the national resources, not breaking away from the state, but more autonomy within the state, more power within the state, or simply being able to speak their own language, or educate their children in their own language, or worship in their own religious institutions. This can bring about ethnic conflict. National conflict is different. National conflict occurs when there's a struggle between one or more groups striving for sovereignty. Frequently, ethnicity is the source or the tool, again, manipulated by elites in this struggle. So, for example, the Abkhazians breaking away from Georgia in 2008, several years ago. Okay, this is a good case of a national conflict. It was an ethnic conflict to the degree that they wanted more autonomy within the state. It became a national conflict when they demanded sovereignty. Okay. So, a case of how ethnicity is used and abused, the case of the former Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a multinational state from after World War II up until 1990, 1991. And then you had the beginning of the breakup. Slovenia and Croatia were the first to go. Why was this a violent breakup? Slovenia left with very little violence. Croatia left with a war. Okay, and then Bosnia and Herzegovina tried to break away. Another war. Okay, eventually most of these pieces broke away. But let's talk about why you had this violent breakup. Well, here are some explanations, some independent variables, potential explanations. One, maybe there were irrevocably opposed cultures. Catholics living in Croatia and Slovenia, Orthodox Christians living in Serbia, Montenegro, Muslims living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But they'd lived together for hundreds of years. They formed a kingdom after World War I with the death of the Ottomans, of the Ottoman Empire. Macedonians left also in 1991. Okay, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia down in the lower right-hand corner. But they were the same, and the same with Montenegrins around 2005, but they were Christians. They were Orthodox Christians. Okay, that's not a great one. How about the second independent variable that people have thrown out there? History of violence. These people have always been involved in violence. Okay, Go back to the battle for Kosovo in the 14th century. World War II, these sides were against each other. Okay? But what about a long history of peace? A very long history of peace. And finally, we've got another independent variable, which is elite manipulation under early democratization. Democratization and the struggle for power. Search out easy causes of problems. Search out easy answers for problems. Populism, right? Blame the other ethnic group. And this is what brings about violent nationalism, another hypothesis. Okay, so let's think about these. Yes, Catholic countries jumped ship first, but so did Muslim and Orthodox ones. So irrevocably opposed cultures, maybe not. Yes, we've got a history of violence, but also a history of peace. So history of violence, probably that's not it. Yes, we've got elite manipulation, but you needed something to manipulate. So it's not necessarily just elite manipulation under early democratization. What did they mobilize around? Well, this brings us to a fourth independent variable, economic grievances. If you look here, what you see are the contributions to the economy in Yugoslavia. And what you'll find is that, lo and behold, the first one out, Slovenia, had the highest GDP per capita. The second one out, Croatia, the second highest GDP per capita. In Yugoslavia, all of the money was collected by the center and then redistributed. The Slovenians and Croatians in the early 1990s said, hey, we haven't been getting our fair share. Okay, this is a different explanation. Okay, and I think it's an important one to understanding what really did happen in Yugoslavia. The point that I'm trying to make here is that ethnic identity, national identity, can often masquerade other underlying issues. So now I want to move into other forms of identity. And actually, I'll take a new slide for this, and we'll talk about political ideology as identity. Or another video for this, sorry.